January 17, 1944, Rapido Valley, Italy. The morning fog clung to the slopes of Monte Cassino like a funeral shroud. From his observation post carved into the frozen limestone, General Lieutenant Fridolin von Sanger und Etterlin raised his field glasses and watched the American positions stirring in the valley below. The air smelled of wet earth and cordite, a combination that had become the signature scent of this cursed mountain. Behind him, in a bunker reinforced with timber salvaged from destroyed farmhouses, his quartermaster stood at attention with a leather-bound ledger open across his palms. The pages were filled with numbers written in precise Gothic script. Artillery shells counted one by one, mortar rounds allocated by the dozen, machine gun belts rationed like gold coins in a miser's vault. Von Sanger lowered his glasses and turned to face the ledger. 48 rounds for the 80mm guns, 112 shells for the Nebelwerfer batteries, 17 belts per machine gun nest for the day's defensive operations. He signed the requisition form with a fountain pen that had belonged to his grandfather, a Prussian officer who had fought at Sedan. The ink was running low. Everything was running low. The general returned the pen to his breast pocket and stepped outside into the cold Italian dawn, where the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino loomed above him like a crown of stone upon the mountain's brow. He had studied philosophy at Oxford before the war. He knew the writings of the Benedictines who had built that sacred place 15 centuries earlier. Now he was tasked with defending it against an enemy whose industrial capacity seemed to mock the very concept of scarcity. Across the valley, on the muddy slopes below the monastery, the American artillery positions were beginning their morning ritual. Von Sanger did not need his field glasses to know what was coming. He had learned to read the signs, the way the gun crews moved with unhurried efficiency, the casual way they stacked ammunition crates beside their howitzers as though the supply trucks would simply bring more tomorrow. And they would. They always did. The first shells began to fall at 0600 hours precisely. Not the careful, calculated bombardment of an army conserving resources, but a thunderous cascade that turned the mountainside into a volcanic eruption of steel and stone. The earth itself seemed to scream. Von Sanger descended into his command bunker and closed the reinforced door behind him. Inside, the walls shook with each impact, and dust fell from the ceiling in fine streams that caught the light from the kerosene lamps. His staff officers stood around a map table, their faces drawn and pale. They had been counting shells since Salerno, since Sicily, since Africa. They knew the arithmetic of defeat. The Battle of Monte Cassino was never supposed to happen. When the Allied forces landed at Salerno in September 1943, the strategic objective was simple: break through the German defensive lines in southern Italy, capture Rome, and continue the liberation of Europe from the soft underbelly that Churchill had promised would yield easily to pressure. But Italy was not soft, and Monte Cassino was not yielding. The mountain dominated the Liri Valley, the only practical route to Rome for a mechanized army. Highway 6, the ancient Via Casalina that had carried Roman legions to their conquests 2,000 years earlier, ran directly beneath the monastery's shadow. Whoever controlled Monte Cassino controlled the road to Rome, and the Germans, with their genius for defensive warfare, had transformed the mountain into a fortress that seemed to belong more to the medieval past than to the mechanized present. The Gustav Line, as the Germans called it, stretched across the Italian peninsula from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic. Monte Cassino was its anchor, its keystone, the central pillar upon which the entire defensive system rested. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in Italy, had personally surveyed the terrain and declared it the strongest defensive position since the Western Front of the First World War. The mountain rose 1,700 feet above the valley floor, its slopes a maze of rocky outcroppings, hidden ravines,
and medieval stone walls that provided ready-made fortifications.
The monastery itself, perched on the summit, offered observation across the entire valley. From its windows, German spotters could call artillery fire onto any target within a radius of 20 miles with pinpoint accuracy. But it was not just the terrain that made Monte Cassino formidable. It was the philosophy behind its defense. The German army that fought in Italy in 1944 was not the same army that had blitzkrieged across Poland and France. That army had been destroyed in the vastness of Russia, swallowed by the steppe and the winter and the inexhaustible reserves of the Red Army. The soldiers who now manned the Gustav Line were survivors of that catastrophe, veterans who had learned the hard lessons of material inferiority. They had learned to fight with less ammunition, less fuel, less food, less hope. They had learned to make every bullet count, to calculate the cost of every artillery barrage, to hoard their resources like monks preserving manuscripts through the Dark Ages. For the Americans who faced them across the valley, this philosophy was incomprehensible. The United States had entered the war with an industrial base that dwarfed anything Europe had ever known. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh and Cleveland ran 24 hours a day, turning out tanks and trucks and artillery pieces in numbers that defied imagination. The shipyards of the East and West Coasts launched Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. The ammunition plants of the Midwest produced shells by the millions, stacking them in depots that stretched to the horizon. American soldiers joked that they were fighting the war with one hand tied behind their backs, the hand that would be needed to carry all the equipment they were issued. This was the fundamental asymmetry of Monte Cassino. Two armies with radically different conceptions of warfare, locked in a struggle over a mountain that had seen empires rise and fall for millennia. The Germans fought with the precision of watchmakers, conserving their strength, calculating odds, making the terrain do the work that men and materiel could not. The Americans fought with the confidence of a nation that had never known scarcity, that believed in the gospel of abundance, that trusted in the power of industrial production to simply overwhelm any obstacle through sheer weight of firepower. Oberst Julius Schlegel commanded the 3rd Battalion, 1st Panzer Grenadier Regiment, dug in on the northern slopes of Monte Cassino. He had been a mathematics teacher before the war, and he still approached combat with a mathematician's mind. Every defensive position was a calculation, every counterattack a theorem to be proved with the minimum necessary force. In his command post, a reinforced cave system that Roman quarrymen had excavated 1,500 years earlier, he maintained a logbook that would have looked at home in a university accounting department. Each entry recorded the day's expenditure: 300 rounds of rifle ammunition, 47 hand grenades, 2 belts for the MG-42 machine guns, 11 mortar shells fired in response to American probes. Schlegel's soldiers called him the accountant behind his back, but they said it with respect. He had kept them alive through Sicily and Salerno by refusing to waste a single bullet on targets that did not matter. When his superiors demanded aggressive patrols and counterattacks to demonstrate German fighting spirit, Schlegel compiled detailed reports proving that such operations consumed resources at rates the supply system could not sustain. He calculated casualty ratios, ammunition expenditure per enemy soldier killed, the mathematical relationship between tactical gains and strategic sustainability. His reports were masterpieces of bureaucratic resistance, and they worked. By January 1944, his battalion was one of the few in the Italian theater that remained at near full strength. Not through luck or superior tactics, but through the ruthless application of mathematical logic to the problem of survival. But even Schlegel's calculations had not prepared him for what the Americans could do when they decided to apply their full industrial weight to a problem. On the morning of January 17th, he stood at the entrance to his cave and watched the American artillery positions across the valley come alive. He began counting the guns he could see, a professional habit from his teaching days, always gathering data, always quantifying reality. He reached 150 howitzers before losing count in the forest of steel barrels that seemed to fill every flat space in the valley below, and those were just the guns he could see. Intelligence reports spoke of entire artillery regiments held in reserve, of ammunition dumps that covered acres of ground, of supply convoys that ran day and night from Naples to the front lines. The bombardment that followed was unlike anything in Schlegel's experience. It was not the careful, methodical shelling of a German artillery battery, conserving its finite stock of shells. It was an industrial process, a form of manufacturing applied to the problem of terrain modification. The shells fell in waves that seemed to have no end, each explosion merging with the next into a continuous roar that shook the mountain down to its ancient bedrock. The Americans were not merely attacking German positions. They were attempting to physically remove the mountain, to erase it from existence through the application of high explosives in quantities that would have supplied a German corps for a month. Schlegel retreated into his cave and closed his logbook. There was no point in recording this. The numbers would not fit on the page. He gathered his staff officers and gave them new orders. Preserve ammunition at all costs. Return fire only when absolutely necessary to stop an infantry assault. Accept casualties from artillery, rather than expose positions by shooting back. The Americans would eventually run out of shells, he told them. They had to. No army in history had ever sustained this rate of fire for more than a few hours. He was wrong. The statistics of the Battle of Monte Cassino read like a catalog of industrial excess. Over the 4 months of fighting between January and May 1944, Allied forces fired approximately 5 million artillery shells at the mountain and its surrounding positions. 5 million shells. To put that number in perspective, the entire German artillery expenditure on the Eastern Front during the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, involving millions of soldiers across a front hundreds of miles wide, totaled around 3 million rounds. At Monte Cassino, a battlefield measuring roughly 4 miles across, the Allies fired nearly twice that number at a single mountain. The logistical effort required to sustain this bombardment was staggering. Each 105mm howitzer shell weighed 33 pounds. Each 155mm shell weighed 95 pounds. The heavy artillery, the 240mm guns that could throw a shell nearly 15 miles, fired rounds that weighed 360 pounds each. These shells arrived in Italy by the shipload, packed in wooden crates stenciled with manufacturer names from Pennsylvania and Ohio and Illinois. They traveled by train from Naples to forward supply dumps, then by truck convoy through the narrow mountain roads to the artillery positions. The trucks ran day and night, grinding up the mountain highways in columns that stretched for miles, their headlights creating rivers of light visible from the German positions. For the American artillery crews, the abundance was both a blessing and a curse. Gunners who had trained to conserve ammunition, who had been taught to calculate firing solutions with care and precision, found themselves ordered to simply pour steel onto the mountain without regard for conservation. Fire missions came down from battalion headquarters with instructions that would have seemed like black comedy to a German artillery officer. Expend all available ammunition on target grid 285443. Reload and repeat until supply trucks arrive. The crews worked in shifts around the clock, their hands blistered from handling shells, their ears ringing from the constant concussion, their minds numbed by the sheer repetitive violence of industrial warfare. Sergeant Michael Donovan, a forward observer with the 34th Infantry Division, later described the experience in his personal diary. "We are not soldiers anymore. We are factory workers. Our factory produces death by the ton and business is good. The guns never stop. When one battery falls silent to clean the barrels or restock ammunition, another battery takes up the rhythm. The mountain is always burning, always exploding, always dying. I think about the German soldiers up there, huddled in their bunkers, counting their bullets while we bury them in steel. Part of me feels sorry for them. Part of me knows they would do the same to us if they could. But they can't. That is the difference between us. The difference between them." That phrase appeared again and again in American accounts of the battle. The soldiers who fought at Monte Cassino came from a nation where scarcity was a temporary inconvenience, not a permanent condition. They had grown up during the Depression, yes, but even in those hard years, America had possessed a fundamental abundance that Europe could barely imagine. The factories might be idle, but they existed. The farms might be foreclosed, but the soil was rich. The potential for plenty was always there, waiting to be activated by the right economic conditions. Now in 1944, those conditions had arrived. The war economy had transformed the United States into an industrial colossus that could simply outproduce its enemies in every category that mattered. For every tank Germany built, America built 5. For every fighter plane Japan manufactured, America made 20. For every artillery shell that left a German munitions plant, American factories produced 50. This was not just a quantitative difference. It was a qualitative shift in the nature of warfare itself. For the first time in history, an army could fight without the constant fear of running out, without the need to husband resources like a miser counting coins. But the Germans at Monte Cassino were not fighting with abundance. They were fighting with memory, the memory of what abundance had once meant before the war, before the Eastern Front, before the reality of German industrial limits became impossible to ignore. General Lieutenant von Zenger had served on the Russian front during the winter of 1941-42, he had watched an entire army starve and freeze because the logistics system could not keep pace with the ambitions of the high command. He had seen soldiers share single rounds of ammunition, had witnessed artillery batteries fall silent for lack of shells, had commanded defensive positions where the phrase fire discipline was not a tactical instruction but a survival necessity. Those memories shaped everything about the German defense of Monte Cassino. Von Sanger's orders to his subordinate commanders were explicit. Every shell fired must result in a confirmed enemy casualty or the destruction of a significant target. Random harassing fire was forbidden. Counter-battery duels with American artillery were to be avoided at all costs. The mathematics of such exchanges always favored the side with more shells. German artillery would fire only in direct support of infantry counterattacks, and even then only after careful calculation of the minimum necessary expenditure. This philosophy created a strange dynamic on the battlefield. The Americans would fire thousands of shells at German positions, pulverizing bunkers and trenches and communication lines. Then their infantry would advance expecting to find nothing but corpses and ruins. Instead, they would encounter fierce resistance from German soldiers who had survived the bombardment in deep bunkers and now emerged to fight with carefully conserved ammunition. American casualties mounted, not because the German defensive fire was particularly heavy, but because it was precisely aimed. Every German bullet seemed to find a target. Every German shell landed exactly where it would do the most damage. American commanders found this maddening. How could an army that was clearly outgunned, outnumbered, and outproduced continue to hold its positions month after month? The answer lay in a fundamental difference in military culture. The American way of war emphasized firepower and mobility, the application of overwhelming force to break through enemy defenses. The German way of war, especially by 1944, emphasized economy of force and defensive strength, the preservation of combat power through careful management of scarce resources. Hauptmann Friedrich Bauer, a company commander in the 1st Parachute Division, embodied this philosophy. Before the war, he had been a forester in Bavaria, a profession that taught patience and long-term thinking. Trees grew slowly. Forests required decades to mature. Resources had to be managed with an eye toward future generations. These habits of mind translated surprisingly well to defensive warfare. Bauer's company held a section of the Gustav Line near the village of Cassino, a position they had fortified over months of careful labor. Every bunker was placed to provide interlocking fields of fire. Every weapon position had multiple fallback positions prepared. Every soldier knew exactly how many rounds he carried and what each round was meant to accomplish. When the American artillery bombardments began, Bauer's men would retreat into the deepest bunkers and wait. They played cards by candlelight while the mountain shook around them. They ate their rations, black bread and tinned meat that would have seemed luxurious 2 years earlier on the Eastern Front. They slept in shifts, conserving energy for the moment when the shelling would stop and the American infantry would come. And when that moment arrived, they would emerge from their holes like miners coming up from a coal pit, blinking in the smoke-filled light, and fight with the precision of men who knew they could not afford to miss. An American intelligence officer, interrogating captured German paratroopers after one failed assault, asked them how they could maintain morale in the face of such overwhelming firepower. One of the prisoners, a veteran of Crete and Russia, laughed bitterly. "You think your shells break our morale?" he said. "We survived Stalingrad. We survived the Kessel. Your artillery is loud, yes, but it is not winter. It is not hunger. It is not hopeless. As long as we have bullets and the Americans must cross open ground to reach us, we will fight. What else can we do?" What else could they do? That was the question that haunted the German defenders of Monte Cassino. Surrender meant prison camps in America or Britain, an end to the war but also an admission of defeat that their ideology would not permit. Fighting to the death was the expected standard, drilled into them by propaganda and reinforced by the presence of SS units in the rear areas who were known to shoot deserters on sight. But there was a third option, one that no one spoke aloud but that every soldier understood. Fight as long as possible with the resources available, then withdraw when the position became untenable. Preserve the army. Live to fight another defensive battle at another river crossing. Another mountain range, another fortified line closer to the Reich. This was the calculus that German commanders at Monte Cassino had to perform every day. How many shells could they afford to fire in defense of this position? How many casualties could they accept before the defensive line broke? How long could they hold before the accumulated weight of American firepower made further resistance suicidal? The answers to these questions were recorded in ledgers and logbooks, calculated with slide rules and abacuses, discussed in whispered conferences in bunkers lit by guttering candles. The turning point came on February 15, 1944, when the Allies made the controversial decision to bomb the monastery itself. For months, Allied commanders had debated whether the ancient structure served as a German observation post. Von Zenger, a Catholic who revered the monastery's historical and spiritual significance, had given strict orders that no German troops were to occupy the building. But Allied intelligence, working from fragmentary reports and aerial photographs, convinced themselves that the monastery was the key to German defensive coordination. At 09:45 hours on a cold February morning, 42 B-17 flying fortresses approached Monte Cassino from the south. They flew in perfect formation, their contrails white against the blue Italian sky. On the ground, soldiers on both sides stopped what they were doing and watched. Some of the Americans cheered, believing that this demonstration of air power would finally break the German defense. Some of the Germans watched in grim satisfaction, knowing that the destruction of a sacred site would only harden their determination to hold the line. The bombs fell for 3.5 hours. 500 tons of high explosives turned the monastery into rubble. The walls that had stood for 15 centuries collapsed into heaps of stone. The frescoes and manuscripts, the accumulated wisdom of generations of monks, disappeared in fire and dust. When the smoke finally cleared, the monastery was gone, replaced by a pile of ruins that provided even better defensive positions than the intact structure had offered. The American infantry attacked that afternoon, advancing up the slopes through the smoke and dust, believing that nothing could have survived the bombardment. They were met with machine gun fire from German positions that had been untouched by the bombs, positions carved into the mountainside itself, impervious to anything short of a direct hit by the heaviest ordnance. The attack failed. The Americans retreated, leaving their dead on the slopes. The Germans remained in their positions, firing carefully aimed shots at any target that presented itself, conserving ammunition even in the moment of defensive victory. Major Hans Jaeger, a battalion commander who had witnessed the bombing from his command post, later wrote in his diary, "They dropped more bombs on that monastery in 3 hours than we have fired artillery shells in 3 months. They can afford to destroy history itself if they think it will shorten the war by a single day. We must count every bullet, every shell, every grenade. They count nothing. This is why we will lose. Not because we are worse soldiers, but because we are poor and they are rich." That entry, discovered after the war in archives captured by Allied forces, captured the essential truth of Monte Cassino. The battle was not ultimately about tactical skill or strategic vision or the courage of individual soldiers. It was about resources. It was about the fundamental capacity of industrial economies to produce weapons faster than soldiers could fire them. It was about the difference between an army that fought with calculators and ledgers and another army that fought with the confidence that there would always be more shells, more bombs, more bullets waiting in the supply dumps behind the lines. The symbolic object that came to represent this difference was not a weapon or a vehicle or a piece of technology. It was something more mundane, more universal, more essentially human: food. Specifically, the C ration, the standard field meal of the American Army. Each ration came in a cardboard box labeled with cheerful military efficiency. Meal, combat individual. Inside was a small miracle of industrial food production: canned meat, crackers, instant coffee, sugar, candy, cigarettes, toilet paper, and a small tin of cheese that soldiers universally despised, but which represented a level of logistical sophistication that no other army in history had achieved. German soldiers who captured American positions, or who encountered abandoned supply dumps, were astonished by the rations. They had been fighting on black bread and tinned meat so old the cans had begun to rust. Their coffee was ersatz, made from roasted acorns and chicory. Their cigarettes were harsh Turkish tobacco rolled in paper that burned the throat. Chocolate was a distant memory from before the war. The idea that an army would include candy and cigarettes in standard field rations seemed like decadent madness. a sign of American softness and lack of military seriousness. But the C ration was not a sign of softness. It was a sign of strength, the strength that came from an economy so productive, so efficient, so fundamentally abundant that it could afford to package individual meals for millions of soldiers and ship them across oceans without straining the system. Every C ration box was a small advertisement for American industrial capacity, a demonstration that the United States could feed its armies in the field with the same casual efficiency that it manufactured tanks and planes and ships. Lieutenant Karl Weber, captured during a nighttime patrol near Cassino in March 1944, later described his first encounter with American rations during interrogation. "They gave me a box, just a cardboard box with food inside. I thought it was a joke, that they were mocking me. But they all had the same boxes. Every soldier the same box. The corporal who guarded me opened his box and ate while he watched me. He offered me a cigarette from his ration, an American cigarette, Lucky Strike, fresh and smooth. I could not believe it. We were fighting for our lives on that mountain, counting bullets and shells, and these Americans were eating like they were on a picnic. That is when I knew we had already lost the war. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but eventually, you cannot defeat an enemy who can afford to give cigarettes to prisoners." The C ration became a form of psychological warfare, though not by design. German soldiers began to fight not just against American tactical superiority or firepower advantage, but against the creeping realization that they were opposing an economic system so vastly superior to their own that military skill and courage could not bridge the gap. Every captured American position revealed more evidence of abundance. Crates of ammunition stacked carelessly, as if bullets were free. Fuel dumps with hundreds of jerry cans. Medical supplies in quantities that would have equipped a German field hospital for months. And always more of those boxes of rations, stacked by the pallet load, ready to feed an army that never seemed to go hungry. The contrast with German logistics was stark. By March 1944, supply convoys to Monte Cassino were under constant air attack. Allied fighter bombers prowled the roads, strafing trucks and blowing up supply dumps. What little ammunition reached the front lines came on mule trains that traveled by night through mountain trails, slow and vulnerable and insufficient. Food supplies dwindled. The soldiers on Monte Cassino began to experience the hunger that their comrades on the Eastern Front had known for years. Not starvation, but the constant gnawing emptiness that sapped energy and morale. In his command post, Oberst Schlegel continued to maintain his logbook, but the entries grew increasingly desperate. The mathematical precision remained. He was still counting every shell, every bullet, but the numbers themselves told a story of gradual degradation. Artillery support requests denied due to lack of ammunition. Counterattacks canceled because the infantry lacked the rifle rounds to sustain a push. Medical supplies running low, meaning that wounded soldiers who might have survived with proper care died instead in cold bunkers because there was no morphine, no plasma, no bandages. And through it all, the American artillery continued to fire. 5,000 shells a day, 10,000, 20,000. The numbers blurred together into a continuous roar that became the soundtrack of the battle. German soldiers learned to sleep through bombardments, their bodies adapting to the constant noise and vibration, the way coal miners adapt to working underground. They emerged from their bunkers between bombardments with ears ringing and hands shaking, to man positions and fire their carefully conserved ammunition at American infantry, who seemed genuinely surprised that anyone had survived the shelling. The final assault on Monte Cassino began on May 11, 1944. By this time, the Allies had assembled a massive force, Polish, British, French, Indian, New Zealand, and American divisions, supported by thousands of artillery pieces and complete air superiority. The plan was to simply overwhelm the German defenders through a simultaneous assault along the entire Gustav Line, preventing the Germans from shifting reserves to threatened sectors. It was a strategy that only an army with unlimited resources could contemplate. No elegant maneuvers, no clever flanking movements, just brute force applied across a broad front until something broke. The bombardment that preceded the assault exceeded anything that had come before. For 48 hours, Allied artillery pounded the German positions without pause. Ammunition trains arrived from Naples in continuous convoys, each train carrying enough shells to supply a German army corps for a week. The shells were unloaded, sorted, distributed, and fired almost in a single continuous motion. The logistics officers who managed this flow worked with the precision of factory foremen, tracking tonnage and calculating supply rates with slide rules and tables of figures. In the German positions, the defenders could do nothing but endure. They had no artillery left to respond with. The guns had been withdrawn to save them from counter-battery fire, and the ammunition stocks were too low to waste on a futile attempt to match the Allied bombardment. They huddled in their deepest bunkers and waited for the infantry assault they knew would follow. Some prayed. Some wrote letters they knew would never be mailed. Some simply sat in silence, conserving energy, each man alone with his thoughts about what was coming. When the Allied infantry finally attacked, they advanced behind a rolling barrage that moved across the mountain like a wave of steel. The German defenders, those who had survived the bombardment, emerged from their bunkers to find a landscape transformed into a moonscape of overlapping shell craters. The carefully prepared defensive positions had been obliterated. The interlocking fields of fire that had been calculated with such care were useless when all the landmarks had been erased. The defense became a series of isolated actions, small groups of soldiers fighting with whatever weapons remained functional, until ammunition ran out or Allied troops surrounded their positions. Hauptmann Bauer's company held out for 3 days before being overrun. When Allied troops entered his command bunker, they found him sitting at a table with his logbook open before him. The last entry read, May 13, 1800 hours. 3 rounds remaining for the machine gun, 18 rifle rounds among 21 men. No water, no food, no orders. We'll hold until dark, then attempt withdrawal. He had not attempted withdrawal. There was nowhere to withdraw to. He surrendered his remaining men and asked that the wounded be treated promptly. The American medics were surprised by his request. They had assumed, based on their own abundant supplies, that the Germans must have medical care available. When they realized that the German wounded had been lying without treatment for days, some of the American soldiers looked at the prisoners with a mixture of pity and incomprehension. How could an army fight without medical supplies? How could soldiers be expected to hold positions when they knew that being wounded meant death? The monastery ruins finally fell to Polish troops on May 18th. The 12th Podolski Lancers raised the Polish flag over what remained of the ancient walls, a gesture heavy with symbolism for men who came from a nation that had been erased from the map by German and Soviet aggression. The German paratroopers who had defended the position were withdrawn during the night, slipping away through mountain trails that Allied forces had not yet blocked. They left behind their dead, their disabled equipment, and a legacy of defensive skill that would be studied by military theorists for generations. But they also left behind something else: ledgers and logbooks, captured by Allied intelligence teams combing through abandoned command posts. These documents provided a window into the German logistics system that few Allied officers had previously understood. The careful accounting, the obsessive conservation, the mathematical precision with which every resource had been allocated. It painted a picture of an army fighting, not just against Allied soldiers, but against the fundamental reality of industrial capacity. One intelligence report, forwarded to General Mark Clark's headquarters, noted, enemy forces at Monte Cassino appear to have been operating under severe ammunition constraints throughout the battle. Captured documents indicate daily artillery allocation of approximately 100 to 150 rounds for an entire divisional sector, compared to our expenditure of 15,000, 20,000 rounds in the same area. Enemy infantry carried average of 30-40 rifle rounds per man, compared to our standard load of 120 rounds. These figures suggest enemy defensive success was achieved despite, not because of, material superiority. Recommend study of German defensive techniques for potential application in future operations. The transformation that Monte Cassino worked on both armies was profound and lasting. For the Americans, the battle demonstrated that firepower alone could not guarantee victory, that even an army with unlimited resources needed time, patience, and tactical skill to overcome a determined enemy in strong defensive positions. The casual confidence of the early months in Italy gave way to a grim understanding that the road to Berlin would be long and bloody, that the Germans would fight for every river crossing and every mountain pass with the ferocity of men who had nothing left to lose. For the Germans, Monte Cassino was a preview of their future. The battle demonstrated that individual courage and tactical skill could delay defeat, but not prevent it. The mathematics were too stark, the disparity in resources too overwhelming. An army that had to count shells could not ultimately prevail against an army that fired millions of rounds without apparent concern for conservation. The ideology of German superiority, already shaken by defeats in Russia and Africa, took another blow from the realization that American industrial might was not a temporary advantage, but a permanent feature of the strategic landscape. General Lieutenant von Senger, who survived the war and wrote his memoirs during the 1950s, reflected on Monte Cassino with the perspective of distance. We fought that battle with the weapons and methods of a poor nation confronting a rich one. We were not stupid or cowardly or tactically incompetent. We were simply outproduced. The Americans could afford to make mistakes because they had enough shells to correct them. We could not afford mistakes because we had no resources to waste on trial and error. In the end, that was the story of the entire war, not superior virtue or ideology on either side, but superior factories and mines and farms on one side, and the mathematical certainty that abundance would eventually triumph over scarcity. The symbolism of the artillery shell became central to post-war German military thinking. The Bundeswehr, when it was reformed in the 1950s as part of NATO, studied the lessons of Monte Cassino intensively. German officers who had fought in Italy were brought in to lecture on defensive tactics and resource management. But the fundamental lesson they taught was not about how to fight with less. It was about ensuring that future German forces would never again be forced to count shells, while their enemies fired millions. The integration of West Germany into the NATO alliance meant access to American logistics systems, American supply methods, American abundance. The next time German soldiers fought, they would fight as part of an alliance that could match and exceed the industrial capacity of any potential enemy. For American military doctrine, Monte Cassino reinforced the lessons that had been developing throughout the war. Firepower worked. Overwhelming material superiority could overcome tactical disadvantages. The key to victory was not elegant operational art, but the ruthless application of industrial strength to military problems. These lessons would shape American military operations for the next 50 years. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the Middle East, with results that were sometimes triumphant and sometimes tragic, but always marked by the fundamental American belief that there would always be enough shells, enough bullets, enough resources to win through sheer weight of materiel. Today, the monastery of Monte Cassino has been rebuilt. It stands once again on its ancient site, a testament to human resilience and the enduring power of faith and culture. Visitors who climb the mountain walk past cemeteries where soldiers from 20 nations lie buried. German and American, Polish and British, French and Italian, all equal now in death, their differences erased by the democracy of the grave. The slopes are peaceful now, covered with trees and grass that have grown over the shell craters and trenches. Birds sing where machine guns once chattered. Children play where men once died, counting bullets. But in the rebuilt monastery, in a small museum dedicated to the battle, there is a display that tells the story more eloquently than words. On one side of a glass case sits a German ammunition ledger, recovered from a destroyed command post. Its pages are filled with careful entries, numbers written in faded ink, each shell and bullet accounted for with Teutonic precision. On the other side of the case sits an American ammunition expenditure report for a single day of the battle, May 12, 1944. The report lists 17,000 artillery shells fired, along with hundreds of thousands of rifle and machine gun rounds, thousands of mortar shells, and countless hand grenades. The German ledger covers 3 months of operations. The American report covers 24 hours. That contrast tells the story of Monte Cassino better than any historical narrative. It speaks to the fundamental truth about modern warfare in the industrial age, that wars are won not by the bravest soldiers or the cleverest generals, but by the factories and farms and mines that feed the machines of war. The Germans counted their shells because they had to, because every round represented precious resources drawn from an economy stretched beyond its breaking point. The Americans fired millions of rounds because they could, because their economy was so vast and productive that ammunition was essentially unlimited. This was not a moral judgment on either side. German soldiers who husbanded their ammunition were not more virtuous than American soldiers who fired freely. They were simply playing different hands in the same brutal game. The Germans fought with the cards they had been dealt by geography and resources and industrial capacity. The Americans fought with the advantages that came from being born in a land of continental scale and natural abundance. Neither side chose the economic conditions under which they fought. They simply adapted their tactics and strategies to the realities they faced. But there was a deeper truth embedded in those statistics, one that transcended the immediate tactical situation at Monte Cassino. The American ability to fire 5 million shells was not just a function of factories and resources. It was a function of a political and economic system that had learned to mobilize abundance for collective purposes without destroying the individual freedoms that made such abundance possible in the first place. The Soviet Union could also produce vast quantities of war materiel, but it did so through a command economy that treated human beings as disposable components in the state machine. The United States produced even more, but its soldiers fought as citizens of a democracy, volunteers who had chosen to serve rather than conscripts compelled by totalitarian diktat. This distinction mattered more than the statistics suggested. The German soldiers at Monte Cassino were fighting for a regime that had promised them greatness through conquest, that had told them their racial superiority entitled them to rule over lesser peoples. When that ideology confronted the reality of American abundance, it revealed itself as a lie. There was no master race, no inevitable German destiny, no 1,000-year Reich. There was only the cold mathematics of industrial production, and those mathematics favored democratic capitalism over fascist autarky. The shells that fell on Monte Cassino were not just explosives. They were arguments made in steel, propositions about which system, democracy or dictatorship, abundance or scarcity, freedom or control, would prevail in the modern world. Every bombardment was a sermon preached by American factories to German soldiers about the superiority of a system that could produce both guns and butter, that could fight a global war while simultaneously raising living standards at home, that could send millions of men overseas while keeping the farms and mines and mills running at full capacity. Oberst Schlegel survived Monte Cassino. He was wounded during the final withdrawal and spent the last year of the war in a military hospital in Bavaria. After the surrender, American occupation authorities briefly detained him as part of the general internment of German military officers. But he was released after a few months when investigators determined he had no connection to war crimes or Nazi party activities. He returned to teaching mathematics at a gymnasium in Munich, where he spent the next 20 years educating German children in a country that had been rebuilt with American aid, defended by American troops and integrated into an American-led alliance. In 1963, a former student asked him about the war. Schlegel rarely spoke about his experiences, but this student was persistent, a young man preparing a university thesis on the Italian campaign. They met in a cafe near the school, and over coffee that cost a few pfennigs, cheap by any standard, abundant in a way that would have seemed miraculous during the war, Schlegel finally opened up about Monte Cassino. "We knew we were losing," he said, stirring sugar into his cup with the absent-minded precision of a man who had spent his life measuring and calculating. Not just the battle, but the war, the entire struggle. You could see it in the numbers. Every week the supply reports showed fewer shells available, longer delays in ammunition deliveries, more restrictions on what we could fire and when. And every week the American bombardments grew heavier. It was like watching a mathematical proof develop, step by logical step toward an inevitable conclusion. We were the equation that didn't balance. They were the solution. The student pressed him. How did the soldiers maintain morale when they knew the situation was hopeless? Schlegel smiled, a sad expression that made him look much older than his years. We didn't think about the overall situation. We thought about the next hour, the next day. We thought about our comrades, about holding our section of the line, about making the Americans pay for every meter of ground. That's how soldiers survive, by narrowing their focus to what they can control. We couldn't control American industrial production or Allied grand strategy. But we could control how many shells we fired and where we fired them. We could count our ammunition and make every round count. It gave us the illusion of agency in a situation where we had none. That interview, preserved in a doctoral thesis that now sits in the archives of the Ludwig Maximilian University, captured something essential about the German experience at Monte Cassino. The counting of shells was not just a logistical necessity, It was a psychological defense mechanism, a way of imposing order and control on a situation that was fundamentally out of control. As long as they were counting, as long as they were calculating and rationing and managing their scarce resources with mathematical precision, they could maintain the fiction that they were still soldiers fighting a battle, rather than victims being ground down by forces too vast to comprehend. The Americans, by contrast, never had to develop such defense mechanisms. They could afford to think in larger terms, to focus on operational and strategic objectives rather than ammunition counts. A platoon leader in the 34th Infantry Division didn't need to know how many shells were available for artillery support. He simply called for fire missions and trusted that the shells would arrive. The psychological freedom that came from this trust, the liberation from constant worry about resources, allowed American commanders at all levels to focus their mental energy on tactical problems rather than logistical constraints. This difference in cognitive load had real effects on battlefield performance. German officers spent hours each day managing supply distribution, adjudicating competing requests for scarce ammunition, calculating risk-reward ratios for every expenditure of resources. American officers spent those same hours planning maneuvers, coordinating combined arms operations, and analyzing intelligence. The mental space freed up by logistical abundance translated into more creative tactics and more aggressive operations. But abundance also created its own problems, ones that would become more apparent in later American conflicts. At Monte Cassino, the overwhelming firepower sometimes became a substitute for tactical creativity. Why develop an elaborate flanking maneuver when you could simply pound the enemy position with thousands of shells? Why risk casualties from close combat when you could stand back and let the artillery do the work? The American way of war, forged at places like Monte Cassino, came to rely heavily on firepower superiority as the solution to tactical problems. This worked well enough when the enemy was a conventional military force holding fixed positions, but it established patterns of thinking that would prove problematic in future conflicts, where the enemy was dispersed, mobile, and indistinguishable from the civilian population. The lessons of Monte Cassino, that overwhelming firepower could overcome any defensive position given enough time, were not universally applicable. But the American military, shaped by its World War II experiences, would spend decades trying to apply those lessons to situations where they didn't quite fit. The destruction of the monastery itself was an early warning of this problem. The decision to bomb a cultural landmark of incalculable historical value was justified on military grounds. Intelligence suggested it was being used by German forces, and removing it might break the defensive line. In retrospect, both justifications proved weak. The Germans weren't using the monastery, and its destruction actually strengthened rather than weakened the defensive position. But the bombing demonstrated a willingness to apply overwhelming force to problems even when the necessity was questionable, a tendency that would recur in later conflicts. German generals, studying the battle in the years after the war, noted this tendency with a mixture of envy and criticism. They envied the abundance that made such operations possible. But they criticized the wastefulness, the lack of precision, the willingness to destroy historical and cultural treasures for minimal military gain. In the rebuilt Bundeswehr, they tried to instill a different philosophy, one that combined American logistical abundance with German tactical precision, that used resources effectively rather than simply abundantly. Whether they succeeded is debatable, but the attempt itself revealed how deeply Monte Cassino had shaped military thinking on both sides. The battle became a case study, a reference point, a constant reminder of what happens when armies with radically different resource bases meet in combat. Military academies from Annapolis to Potsdam taught the lessons of Monte Cassino, though each drew somewhat different conclusions from the same set of facts. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson of Monte Cassino was not about tactics or strategy or logistics, but about the relationship between economic systems and military outcomes. The battle demonstrated with brutal clarity that warfare in the modern age is fundamentally an industrial enterprise, that victory goes not to the most skillful or courageous army, but to the one backed by the most productive economy. This was not a new insight. Military theorists had understood the importance of economic strength since ancient times, but Monte Cassino provided empirical proof in a form so stark that it could not be denied or rationalized away. The 5 million shells fired at Monte Cassino represented something more profound than simple material superiority. They represented a political and economic system that had solved the problem of scarcity, at least temporarily, at least for the duration of the war. The United States in 1944 was not a perfect society. Racism, inequality, and injustice remained endemic. But it was a society that had learned to produce abundance at a scale that previous generations would have considered miraculous. And it was willing to share that abundance, not just with its own soldiers but with its allies through programs like Lend-Lease that kept Britain and the Soviet Union supplied with American weapons and materiel. This generosity was not purely altruistic. It served American strategic interests to keep allies in the fight. But it also reflected a fundamental confidence that there was enough to go around, that American productivity was so vast that it could supply multiple armies simultaneously without straining the home economy. German planners, accustomed to thinking in zero-sum terms where every shell sent to Italy was one less shell available for the Eastern Front, found this attitude incomprehensible. How could a nation afford to be generous with war materials? The answer was that America wasn't generous with scarce resources. It was abundant to the point where traditional concepts of scarcity no longer applied. The soldiers who fired those 5 million shells at Monte Cassino carried that abundance with them after the war. They returned home to a country that used its wartime industrial capacity to build the most prosperous economy in human history. The factories that had produced artillery shells turned to producing automobiles and refrigerators and televisions. The organizational skills developed to manage military logistics were applied to supply chains that brought consumer goods to every corner of the nation. The confidence born of wartime abundance translated into an era of economic expansion that lifted millions into the middle class. The German soldiers who had counted their shells at Monte Cassino also carried their experience forward, but in a different direction. They returned to a country that had been physically and economically destroyed, that had to rebuild from rubble with the assistance of the same American abundance they had faced in combat. The Marshall Plan, which poured billions of dollars into European reconstruction, was in some sense the peacetime continuation of the artillery bombardment, another demonstration that America could afford to be generous because its productivity was so vast that generosity was simply good policy. This too shaped the post-war world. The economic integration of Western Europe under American leadership, the creation of NATO as a military alliance backed by American industrial power, the long Cold War struggle against Soviet communism, all of these were rooted in lessons learned at places like Monte Cassino. The demonstration that democratic capitalism could outproduce totalitarian systems in wartime suggested it could do the same in peacetime. And for the most part, it did. The monastery of Monte Cassino stands today as a monument to the resilience of faith and culture, but also as a reminder of what happens when ideologies backed by different economic systems meet in combat. The shells that destroyed it in 1944 were manufactured in factories built by free workers earning wages, operated under a system that protected individual rights even during total war. The shells that the Germans couldn't afford to fire in response came from an economy that had subordinated everything to military production, that had stripped its people of freedom in pursuit of conquest, and that had discovered too late that tyranny is less productive than liberty in the long run. This was the ultimate truth that Monte Cassino taught, that abundance is not just a material condition, but a moral one, that societies which respect individual freedom tend to produce more wealth than societies which crush it, and that this wealth translates into military power when necessary. The Americans who fired 5 million shells at Monte Cassino were not better human beings than the Germans who counted their ammunition one round at a time. But they were citizens of a better system, one that had learned to generate prosperity without sacrificing freedom. And that prosperity made all the difference when the shooting started. The ledgers and logbooks kept by German officers at Monte Cassino, now preserved in museums and archives, stand as testimony to the dignity of soldiers who fought honorably under impossible conditions. The careful accounting, the precise mathematics, the determination to fight effectively despite resource constraints. These were professional military virtues worthy of respect. But they were also symbols of a system that had failed, An ideology that had promised greatness but delivered only scarcity and defeat. The American ammunition expenditure reports from the same battle, equally preserved in archives, tell the opposite story. The casual expenditure of vast quantities of materiel, the confidence that supplies would always be available, the freedom from constant worry about scarcity. These were the luxuries of abundance, and they came from a system that had proven more productive, more adaptable, and ultimately more humane than its fascist competitors. 70 years after the battle, visitors to Monte Cassino can stand on the mountainside and look down at the valley, where two armies clashed over competing visions of how the world should be organized. The scars have mostly healed. The shell craters are gone, filled in by decades of weathering and growth. The bunkers have collapsed or been buried. Nature has reclaimed what war destroyed. But the lesson remains, carved not in stone but in memory, passed down through histories and memoirs and the stories soldiers told their children and grandchildren. It is a lesson about the price of counting shells, about the cost of scarcity imposed by ideology and autarky, about the strength that comes from abundance generated by freedom and democracy, about the difference between an army that fights because it must conserve every resource and an army that fights knowing there will always be enough. The German generals counted their shells at Monte Cassino because they had no choice. The Americans fired 5 million rounds for the same reason. And in that difference lay the outcome not just of a battle or a campaign, but of a war and ultimately of a century. The monastery bells ring again today, calling the Benedictine monks to prayer as they have for 15 centuries, interrupted only briefly by the violence of 1944. Their sound carries across the valley where the shells once fell, a reminder that some things endure beyond even the most devastating demonstrations of industrial warfare. But on quiet days when the wind blows just right across the mountainside, some say you can still hear a distant echo, not of explosions, but of someone counting carefully and precisely, trying to make limited resources last just one more day, one more hour, one more round. That echo is the sound of history teaching its hardest lesson, that in modern war, the nation that must count its shells will lose to the nation that doesn't have to count at all.